Welcome to the study of Daniel. The title I'd suggest for this prophetic book is The Expatriate Prophet Statesman, indicating his dual role, a career in bureaucracy and his service as a prophet, and the fact that he is filling this role outside of his homeland, Israel. Several statements help me to summarize this very important book. Some of them are direct quotes taken right out of the chapters of Daniel, such as the first one from chapter 5, verse 21. A major point of this book is to indicate that, quote, "The Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of humankind and sets over them anyone he wishes." Daniel is operating outside Israel. He's in foreign territory. He is operating with empires, the Babylonian Empire, which has succeeded the Assyrian and will be toppled by the Persian Empire. Daniel will serve in the Persian Empire as well. So he's very conscious of world powers and even more conscious that the God he serves is sovereign over those merely human empires, and God can set up any ruler he wishes. Secondly, from chapter 2, verse 22, God is in the business of revealing deep and hidden things. There is a considerable amount of revelation that goes on in the course of this book, revelation of events pending. And from chapters 3 and 6, indications that God is able to deliver his followers from regimes which are oppressive. However, not everyone will be rescued. Chapter 11, verse 33 indicates that some will perish, even though they are close followers of God. So these are some of the themes which weave through the rich 12 chapters comprising the book of Daniel. Let's now look at an outline of these 12 chapters, broken into two parts. Part A will give us a sequence of 6 stories concerning Daniel and his friends. First is the account in chapter 1 of Daniel and his friends arriving in Babylon, deported in 605, and determining that they will not defile themselves with food which would not be appropriate for a Jewish person to eat. Let me put up on the right some of the information which we have regarding locations and dates. We know that this first one is located in Babylon, in the capital itself, not simply in the empire, and takes place soon after Daniel arrives, so that would be 605. In chapter 2, Daniel provides an explanation for King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian's dream, a dream about a massive statue comprised of various elements, 4 elements in particular. And we understand that this took place 1 year later, which would located in 604. The actual site is not indicated. Perhaps it was in the capital of Babylon. In chapter 3, we have not so much a vision or some dream, but rather the account of King Nebuchadnezzar setting up a massive golden idol, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, and then commanding everyone to worship it. Daniel is not himself mentioned in this chapter, but his 3 friends are, his 3 Jewish friends, and they determine not to worship this idol, and consequently are tossed into a furnace from which they escape unscathed, rescued. We are simply told that this happens in the province of Babylon, in a location known as the Plain of Dura. We're not exactly sure where that was. The time, we're not given a date stamp for chapter 3. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar again has a dream about a great tree, and a warning that because of an arrogant attitude which he embraces, he will be humbly reduced before being restored to power. No location, no date for this one. Chapter 5 advances to the end of the Babylonian Empire. Belshazzar, son and co-regent with Nabonidus, throws a party and utilizes some of the treasures which had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar from the temple of Jerusalem. During the course of that party, a hand appears miraculously on a wall, an inscription is made, Daniel is called to read it and interpret it. Daniel indicates that the lights are about to go out for the Babylonian Empire, and that same day, in fact, the Persians come in and conquer Babylon, the capital of the empire. We know from other resources that this took place on October 12 of the year 539, as Cyrus II led the Persians in conquest of the Babylonians. The last of Part A, Chapter 6, tells about a plot against Daniel as a leading bureaucrat in the Persian Empire. We are not given the location of it. We are told that the ruler is named Darius, so we understand it would have been somewhere following 539, since the Persians are now in power. Part B takes the remaining 6 chapters, and these are rather indications of heavenly messages, visions, and comparable experiences. Chapter 7 is a vision which Daniel receives, and we're told that this happens while Belshazzar is the ruler. So at chapter 7, we're resetting the clock in a sense as far as the date stamps for these chapters. And we understand it would have been 554 based on the regnal year that's given. There are 4 beasts that show up in succession with some contention, and these represent various rulers or empires. Chapter 8, vision of a ram and a goat. As far as the location here, we are told that Daniel is in Susa, and he is in fact there on the west side of the city, as we understand it, since he is at the Ulai River. The regnal year would indicate this as 552 BC. Chapter 9 is a very rich chapter because it presents Daniel aware of the prophecy of Jeremiah indicating 70 years will elapse before Israel will be allowed to rebuild their nation and the city of Jerusalem. Consequently, this moves Daniel to prayer. It's fascinating because we have an indication right in Scripture that he is aware of another prophet's ministry and the prophecy which Jeremiah had issued for the encouragement of the exiles. We understand the ruler in Daniel's environment is named Darius, and the year there would be 539 when the Persians first came to power. The last 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12, contain a message which Daniel is given in particular aimed at the end of days. Cyrus is the named leader in this era, or in this particular vision, this message. The year would be 536 based on the regnal designation. We do not have a location. Was this in Susa? Was it in some other major city? We're not told exactly. So this gives us an overview of the 12 chapters of Daniel. As to the historical context, we want to acknowledge that we locate the prophecy of Daniel as far as the eras of prophetic books. We locate it in the Persian era. We want to acknowledge, though, that he begins with the Babylonian exile. So technically, we might designate him as Babylonian era - Persian era. He's designated Persian because that's where he concludes. The bright green region indicates the extent of the Persian Empire. You can see some of the key cities. Of course, Babylon, the heart of the Babylonian Empire. And then Shushan, or Susa, which was the capital of the Elamite kingdom and very strategic for the Persians as well. Persepolis, which in 518 was built as capital of the Persian Empire. It's not at the outset of the Persian Empire. It's Darius I building that a little bit after Daniel's time. On the far left, far west, you see Sardis, capital of Lydia, and this was one of the important sites which Cyrus II conquered as the Persian Empire is building and preparing to overwhelm the Babylonian Empire. Daniel then once again taken captive to Babylon from Jerusalem in 605 by Nebuchadnezzar. There are a sequence of these maps that come from the Logos Bible software, which help us get a picture of these movements. So first, the cyan curve indicated with the numeral 1, reminding us the route of Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns against Palestine. In particular, we're interested in the 605 campaign when Daniel was captured. At that time, after being victorious in the Syro-Palestine region, Nebuchadnezzar hurries home across the desert, suggested here by the number 2 cyan line. At the news of his father's death, he rushes home and is installed as the king of Babylonia. Daniel follows soon after, brought by armies, the Babylonian armies, by a slightly longer route. Now, this Nebuchadnezzar will rule until his death in 562. He's followed after an interval of 6 years with a rapid succession of a variety of leaders, followed in 556 by Nabonidus. Nabonidus is an unusual ruler. He vacates Babylon in favor of moving to a West Arabia city, an oasis city of Tamar. He has some trouble with some of the outlying areas, and so encourages the Persian leader Cyrus II to engage Aristides of the Medes, and he is victorious over them in the year 550. Cyrus goes on uninvited and conquers Lydia, particularly taking their capital, Sardis, there on the far west. So this is an indication of the growing strength of the Persians. The red line on this map points out the fact that Nabonidus, who was ruler of Babylon at that time, a successor, after a 6-year interval, successor to Nebuchadnezzar, leaves Babylon. He places his son, Belshazzar, in charge of Babylonia, and particularly the capital of Babylon, while he is gone. He is gone for approximately 10 years. And the fourth line, the cyan, reminds us that with Nabonidus' approval, Cyrus II of Persia takes care of the Medes, which was a problem to Nabonidus, and then moves on to the west to conquer Lydia, in particular its capital, Sardis. With this strength that Cyrus II is amassing, he then turns his attention back to the Empire of Babylonia, finally taking the capital itself on October 12th, 539. This is something that Habakkuk prophesied would happen. Eventually, violent Babylon would itself be punished. Cyan line number 5 depicts Cyrus II conquering the capital of the Babylonian Empire in 539. Soon after gaining control of the Babylonian Empire, Cyrus of Persia swiftly issues what came to be known as the Edict of Restoration. This was a benevolent policy which made him dearly loved by so many of his people, the people that he ruled over. And the reason was this: he had inherited along with the empire many, many displaced persons who, such as the Israelites, had been deported. With the Edict of Restoration, he authorized them to return to their homelands. The Jews were one of those groups who received that permission. This is one of the most amazing and remarkable archaeological finds, because here we have what's come to be known as the Cyrus Cylinder, and it records for us this Edict of Restoration. You can find it in the British Museum. That took place in 538. He came to power in 539. As we lay the time span of Daniel's ministry, roughly 605 to 536, alongside that of other prophets, it's interesting to observe that he overlaps with Jeremiah. In fact, he names Jeremiah, as noted earlier in chapter 9. And he would have overlapped with Ezekiel, who was, like Daniel, operating in Babylonia. Haggai and Zechariah will commence their ministries back in Israel, encouraging the rebuilding of the temple, about 520 BC. So their lives may have overlapped a bit. If not, Haggai and Zechariah come relatively soon after the last date that we have for Daniel. So to summarize, we find Daniel bridging both the Babylonian and the Persian empires, beginning with his deportation under Nebuchadnezzar in 605 and extending into the Persian conquest. We have the date, one of the dated items would be 538, and another dated item names Cyrus and indicates it's the third year of his reign, which would put it at 536 BC. With the help of this timeline, we'll be better able to get a picture of the events surrounding Daniel's ministry. We want to keep in mind that Nebuchadnezzar, leading the Babylonian Empire, is exerting powerful strength. He's assisted at times by Cyaxares the Mede. Babylon exerts pressure on Israel. In particular, we're thinking of 597, when Jehoiakim is taken captive and Ezekiel along with him to Babylonia. The Babylonians establish Zedekiah as their appointed ruler in Jerusalem in 597. After an attempt to throw off Babylonian hegemony, the Babylonians return to Jerusalem, lay siege for a year and a half, and eventually the city falls to them in 586. Over this period, Jeremiah is serving as prophet on location in Israel, in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562. Over the next 6 years, the Babylonian Empire experienced a series of rulers, leading to the rise of a high official of Aramean origin by the name of Nabonidus. His is an unusual reign in two regards. First, he replaces worship of the chief Babylonian deity Marduk with the moon god Sin. Second, he abandons Babylon as capital for roughly a 10-year period, relocating instead to Tamar, a large oasis in western Arabia. During that period, he leaves the capital in the hands of his son Belshazzar. This is the Belshazzar that we know from the story of the handwriting on the wall in Daniel chapter 5. Nabonidus will return to Babylon, but it will be too late. The Persians gained strength under Cyrus II, eventually becoming strong enough to overthrow the capital of Babylonia, the city of Babylon itself, in 539. At that time, as the Persians inherit the Babylonian Empire, they inherit with it the various displaced peoples, including the Israelites. Cyrus' policy is one of goodwill. He wins over many people by treating them kindly. Case in point, his Edict of Restoration only a year after he has taken over the Babylonian Empire. 538 then is the time when Israelites, among others, are authorized to return to their homeland if they wish. One event which I purposely withheld, and you may have observed that, is the fact that Daniel, back in 605, during the reign of Jehoiakim, is taken captive, deported by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, taken to Babylonia. And that is the onset of his recorded ministry. His career is as a bureaucrat, first in the Babylonian Empire, serving Nebuchadnezzar. Subsequent to that, serving Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son and co-regent. Once the Babylonian Empire falls, Daniel will proceed to serve the Persian court. We can review some of the same events in a little different fashion with the use of this chart. As usual, focus particularly on the third column from the left, the one headed in yellow, Israelite prophets. Here we locate Daniel, whose ministry spanned roughly 605, the onset of his deportation, to 536. It's during the reign of Israelite King Jehoiakim that he is deported. This happens because of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian troops rolling into Syro-Palestine and taking captives. So Daniel will serve Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar returns and lays siege to Jerusalem while Daniel is still in Babylon. Jerusalem will fall to Nebuchadnezzar in 586. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562. After some upset in rule, Nabonidus, together with his son Belshazzar, come to the throne. Daniel continues to serve the Babylonian court. Cyrus II comes to a period of power leading the Persian Empire, eventually gaining enough strength to overthrow the capital of Babylonia, the city of Babylon itself, in 539. Daniel now serves the Persian Empire. Cyrus II issues a benevolent edict, the Edict of Restoration, 1 year into his position of authority after overthrowing the Babylonian Empire. That takes place in 538. At this time, Israelites, among others, are authorized to return to their homeland. Let's get a sense of some of the key locations in the life and ministry of Daniel, once again using Google Earth. He would have been originating in Jerusalem when in 605 Nebuchadnezzar deported him along with several other elite members of that country, and then was brought likely over this route to the Empire of Babylonia, in particular to Babylon. Key sites within the life of Daniel will be Babylon and also Susa. We find him reporting on being at both locations. Susa is a very ancient city and was the capital of the Elamite kingdom. Persepolis will not figure until shortly after Daniel's era. It became a capital, major city for the Persians, but was not built until 518, and that's shortly after what we understand to be Daniel's era. So here we are on the ancient site of Babylon, the palace grounds. This is the location of a prominent ram statue, and leading up this boulevard to what's known as the Ishtar Gate, a very, very beautiful ancient gate. You can see here the lions that have been depicted on this representation of this massive and splendid gate. In a moment, we'll show you what the archaeologists have recovered of these brick composited, glazed, beautiful lions. Here is one of the lions from the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. It's preserved in the Oriental Institute Museum, attached to the University of Chicago. You can see it there if you ever visit that city. This is Babylon. Daniel was here. Daniel also served in Susa. What you see here in this somewhat diamond-shaped enclosure is the actual excavation area of the royal city of Susa. The territory up in the northwest is also an ancient palace site. To get a better idea of the layout, let's make use of an overlay provided by the Iranica Encyclopedia, found at www.iranica. Features to note in particular: the river. This is the Ulai River or Ulai Canal over on the west side of the ancient city. The diamond-shaped ancient city itself of Susa or Shushan. The palace of Darius I. And it's interesting to note the Acropolis here as well. The palace of Artaxerxes II is located off to the northwest. Let's render the plan a little more transparent, and you can see how it follows the topography. This is ancient Susa, a venerable city and a place where Daniel served. While we're in the neighborhood, let's take a look at Persepolis. This will not be the Persian capital until 518, when Darius I, Darius the Great, will establish that. Consequently, this is not a place where Daniel records having visited. Get a beautiful sense of the archaeological excavations from this Google perspective. One of the rich discoveries of archaeologists, which they found there at Persepolis, is the column capital in the form of a man bull. Notice the figure on the right, in particular at the very top of it, where you see two faces, one directed to the right, one directed to the left, and below the beards of those figures you see the limbs, as it were, the limbs of a bull, the front legs. This dates to the early 5th century BC, the reign of Xerxes, so this is certainly after the era of Daniel, but a rich example of statuary. And here you see the top of that capital. This is one of the refinements found at Persepolis. It's housed in the Oriental Institute Museum in Chicago. Now let's consider Daniel as an individual. What can we learn about him? A few points. We like to inquire whether or not we know concerning the call of a certain prophet. How was it that they came to begin serving God? We don't have anything like this. We simply have his story, and we understand that when he found himself in an unfamiliar territory in Babylon, he responded with faithfulness, seeking to honor the God that he had served in Israel by refusing to eat food which would not have been appropriate for him. We know something about people around him. For example, we have the names of some fellow travelers, Jewish colleagues, and we have one report that when they were in duress, they got together and they sought God's help, and God provided a revelation which gave them particular prominence in the Babylonian Empire, because here were some people, Daniel in particular, who was a mouthpiece for God, interpreting a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had received. We know a bit about co-workers in the host nation, and now we're not thinking of fellow Jewish individuals, but Babylonians or Persians. And we have at least one account where people were resentful of the effectiveness with which Daniel carried out his role. We have several reports of kings expressing appreciation and giving honor to Daniel as he served them faithfully. These would be, once again, not Jewish kings, but Babylonians or Persians. The book of Daniel is both an intriguing book and at the same time a puzzling book. It's important for us to acknowledge several puzzles that have at times baffled scholars within the context of the 12 chapters of Daniel. In the comments that follow, I'll be drawing on Gleason Archer's book on the Old Testament, as well as Hassel Bullock's book on prophets. The first involves the placement of the book of Daniel among the Ketuvim, as it's known in Hebrew, this particular collection, subunit of the Hebrew Bible. Ketuvim is the writings, and this would include Psalms, Proverbs, books such as Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And our interest here is asking the question, why do the Hebrew scriptures locate the book of Daniel in among those writings rather than with the prophets themselves? Why is Daniel not classed directly with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, some of these? Interestingly, Josephus indicates that Daniel was placed among the prophets, that is to say, that section of the Hebrew Bible known as the Nevi'im, in the 1st century. And so we conclude that its assignment in the writings, being relegated to Psalms, Proverbs, and associated with these books, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, this association must have come later. And the reason for its association there is not surprising. After all, Daniel was not appointed or ordained formally as a prophet, as we find, for example, Isaiah and Jeremiah being particularly called, or even Samuel. But rather, he remained a civil servant. In addition, the circumstances surrounding Daniel, when he is reported to have actually lived and served, those are relatively late and may bridge well with Ezra and Nehemiah. Of course, on that last point, one could observe that Zechariah and Haggai are operating in a time frame that's contemporaneous with Daniel, but they were included with the prophets. So you may want to concentrate rather on the fact that Daniel was not called as a prophet. We don't see that as his formal career. It's just something that became very, very significant as God began giving him a variety of messages. So first then, the placement among the Ketuvim in the Hebrew division of Scripture. Second involves the date of Jerusalem's invasion. It's been suggested that the date of Jerusalem's invasion, as reported through Daniel, when we come to the part of the book that deals with where he reflects on when that invasion took place. Some have seen some discrepancies between that and other places where we have record of the invasion of Jerusalem. Subsequent to that, it's been observed that Daniel seems to be following a Babylonian way of recording time and reporting events rather than a Hebrew way of reporting events, and this can even out that seeming discrepancy. A third puzzle has to do with how the Chaldeans are referred to within the book of Daniel. Some translations will not use the word Chaldeans, they'll simply say Babylonians. So that's the word that we're focusing in on. And at issue here is, are the Chaldeans an ethnic group or are they a ruling class? In the main, Daniel seems to refer to the Chaldeans as a ruling class. However, it's worth observing that in Daniel chapter 5, verse 30, Chaldeans or Babylonians are indeed referred to and recognized as an ethnic group. It seems likely that this term may have actually had a double meaning, so that for us to simply understand it as one or the other rather reflects on our poor grasp of the connotations of that term in its original era, both ethnic and a ruling group. The identity of Belshazzar in chapter 5 has been seen as problematic. Here's the issue. From other records, we know that Nabonidus was the leader of the Babylonian Empire at this time. And so the question has arisen, why does Daniel refer to Belshazzar, not to Nabonidus, in this period? However, later discoveries from cuneiform tablets do actually refer to Belshazzar as quote-unquote son of the king. And so we've come to understand this as a co-regency. As a result, this supposed problem has largely dissolved. In fact, Bullock notes that Daniel appears to be aware of Belshazzar's position as second ruler, that is, co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. Since in chapter 5, verses 16 and 29, when Belshazzar honors Daniel, he gives him the position of third in the kingdom. Bullock suggests that this may indicate that Belshazzar himself was second, and then that would point back to Nabonidus, whom we know of through other records, not through Daniel, Nabonidus as the primary ruler. What about the relationship between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar? In chapter 5, Belshazzar is referred to as son of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, actually, he was not. He was son of Nabonidus. So, how should we understand this? The best way to understand this is to realize that the word son in such a context can mean successor in the same office, whether or not there was actually a blood relationship. Darius the Mede is referred to in Daniel chapter 9. This is the individual who is credited with the new empire once the Babylonian Empire finished. So the general assumption has been, or the question, the puzzle has been, why is not Cyrus II named within Daniel as the Persian inheriting the Babylonian Empire, well, actually conquering it, but then the one who took over all that territory? From other records, we know it to be Cyrus. In fact, Cyrus is named within Daniel elsewhere. Why then this Darius the Mede in chapter 9? Some have proposed that since the name Darius is used, perhaps what is meant by this is a later ruler, actually, in the lineup, Darius, son of Histaspes. We know from other records that this individual, Darius, son of Histaspes, was the third successor of Cyrus. So there was a known leader of that empire subsequent to Cyrus. And as you can see, this would be problematic in Daniel because Daniel says that someone by the name of Darius was the first ruler over Babylon when the Babylonians fell and the Persians moved in. Scholars call our attention, however, to the way this is described, where the way Darius the Mede is described. First of all, he's listed not as Darius the Persian, but Darius a Mede. Darius, son of Histaspes, would not fit Daniel's description, particularly when he's described as a Mede. Further, the statement in Daniel 9:1 that Darius was made, notice that, homlach, he was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, would indicate that he was invested with kingship by some higher authority. He was, in a sense, appointed. That wouldn't be said of Cyrus II. He was not made king. You might say he bullied his way in. He did not need anyone to authorize him. He was the king. So scholars call our attention to the particular statement that this Darius the Mede was made king and suggest that it would be someone like Cyrus who appointed Darius the Mede in this leadership position. And so it's suggested that he was installed, Darius the Mede was installed as viceroy, not king of the entire empire, but viceroy in Babylonia, this particular region, by Cyrus the Great, Cyrus II, who was, we know, the leader of the Persians when they overtook Babylonia. Well, that still doesn't answer the question, who would this Darius the Mede have been? And now, quoting from Archer, there is powerful cumulative evidence to show that he is to be identified with a governor named Gubaru. We know of this Gubaru from other resources, who is referred to both by the cuneiform records and by the Greek historians as playing a key role in the capture of Babylon and its subsequent administration. So what's suggested by Archer is that this Darius the Mede is none other than Gubaru, that we know from other resources as having been in charge of Babylonia, appointed by or authorized by the Persians and Cyrus II over him. Well, then how do you come up with a name Darius? Well, why didn't they just say Gubaru? Well, here are some possibilities. The name Darius, or as it would have been in Persian, Darayavhush, according to William Foxwell Albright, may have been a title of honor, not his given name, but rather a title of honor such as Caesar or Augustus in the Roman Empire. Those were not their original names. Those were names that they were given as extra titles of honor. In addition, if we examine medieval Persian language, we find that Dara, which is the first part of this Darius in its actual Persian form, Dara means king. So possibly, this is conjectural, possibly Darayavhush, Persian behind what's rendered in the Hebrew Bible as Darius, may have meant the royal one. Another possible explanation of this is that the record in Daniel is not to be taken as closely related to the historic events as I've described earlier in this lecture on the history and historical context of Daniel. If instead the book should be dated to perhaps the 2nd century or considerably later than the era that we generally located in, then perhaps we should not hold tightly to the historic references, but just understand that it conveys a general theological message of apocalyptic hope, some stories that are intended to encourage people of God's care over individuals following him even when they're in hostile circumstances. You'll find a number of scholars that take this late dating of Daniel. The material that I'm presenting here gives some alternatives to the late dating and suggests how do some scholars make sense of Daniel associating that book with the era that's described, particularly in chapters 1 through 6, locating it with the close of the Babylonian Empire and the onset of the Persian Empire. Another interesting puzzle involves what kind of languages we encounter as we read through the book of Daniel. Daniel's very unusual in that a slice in the middle, actually located towards the front, roughly half of the book, has been written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. The break occurs at chapter 2, verse 4, the last half of it. And the content there is rather interesting. Chapter 2, verse 4 begins, "The Chaldeans said to the king," and then parenthetically in Aramaic, and right there the text switches from good standard biblical Hebrew over to good standard Aramaic. "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will reveal the interpretation." That is attributed to these Chaldeans who would normally speak in Aramaic, and that's an important feature. This is not like bringing in a totally alien language. This would have been the everyday language of the people surrounding Daniel in Babylon. So very appropriate that just when the Babylonians begin to speak in chapter 2, the Chaldeans begin to speak, why the message is presented in their own language. Curiously now, it stretches out through the end of chapter 28. Chapter 28 being the first of the apocalyptic visions which Daniel has, the first in that second half of the book, 7 through 12. All of chapter 7 is in Aramaic as well. That happens to be the vision of the four beasts and the announcement that God is sovereign over all, and he is the ultimate ruler. And then as chapter 8 opens up, the language reverts back to standard biblical Hebrew. So it's a curious development. We don't know exactly why this happens. I'll just offer a theory or two that may account for it. Some suggest that perhaps the book was originally entirely, chapter 1 through 12, written in Aramaic, and then partially translated back to Hebrew. Perhaps this would have helped so that the book would have been acceptable for the canon of Hebrew Scriptures to make it feel authorized. Well, the problem with that argument is this: why didn't the translators go all the way? If they wanted it to be acceptable in Hebrew, why did they leave a center block in Aramaic? Another theory is that perhaps these particular chapters, 2 through 7, had the most bearing on a non-Jewish population of the empire, and so were written in the language of that non-Jewish population of the Babylonian Empire. Chapters 1 and then 8 through 12 may have had a little more relevance for Jewish population, and so would be left in Hebrew. And you can examine the contents of those books. There's some reason why that's been suggested, but in the last analysis, frankly, it remains a puzzle. The next involves looking forward beyond the reported time frame of Daniel himself and the Babylonian start of the Persian Empire, looking forward out of that era to a historic individual known as Antiochus Epiphanes. The question that arises is this: as we examine how Daniel describes certain events, particularly along about chapter 11, verse 31, as we examine these events and then compare later history and what took place, particularly the desecration of the Temple of Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC, there is a striking degree of similarity with Daniel's predictions, his prophecies. So much so that some have been uncomfortable with that and felt that this could not have been predictive prophecy, but rather after the event, and then casting it back, retrojecting it as if it were predicted. There's just such a high degree of correlation. The events in Daniel 11 are too close to what Antiochus Epiphanes actually committed, the travesties that he committed. Well, it's possible. We have to allow the possibility that this material was written after the event, and then somehow to cast a sense that piously God was portrayed as being in control and knowing ahead of time. However, we want to examine within the context of a discussion like that, a debate like that, we want to examine our presuppositions. And the foremost of which, in my mind, is: are we allowing for supernatural events, such as God's foreknowledge of what is yet to come, or are we disallowing that? Some may allow it and say, however, in this circumstance, they don't think it's operating. So there's a range of possibilities. You'll find me open. My presupposition is that God can know and can describe to his people ahead of time what's happening, even in fairly high detail. So this does not cause a difficulty for me, but it will influence others, and you may encounter these, or perhaps you have been taught this in the past, that Daniel is actually a late work looking backwards on past events. One consideration in that regard that I found rather interesting has to do with the fact that the book of Daniel, we do find it included in the Septuagint, represented on the screen here as the LXX. The Septuagint, that is the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's thought by most to have been completed around 180 BC. That is, the Hebrew was translated into Greek and completed by around 180 BC. Now, if Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't commit his travesty until 168, then the fact that we have got Daniel included in this Greek translation that's already done and already presenting events that look like Antiochus Epiphanes, well, it seems like that was done before Antiochus Epiphanes came on the scene. I am not aware of scholars' response to that. No doubt there are some responses. I just haven't dug into it to uncover that. But it's something to be aware of before prematurely concluding that Daniel's material presented as predictive could not have been. It's worth considering this argument.